Welcome, Outside Landers. I'm Nicole Meldahl, Executive Director of Western Neighborhoods Project, and I am thrilled to start Shipwreck Week 2024 with a whale of a program for you and far too many maritime puns already. It's called Shipwrecked Again, a reprise of the program that we held at the Balboa Theater last year, in which esteemed experts dive into the history of shipwrecks that live forever just off the Western neighborhood's shores and maybe slightly beyond them sometimes. But before we get into all of that, I would like to, if you don't mind, briefly plug our work at Western Neighborhoods Project for those who don't know. We are officially a 501c3 California nonprofit that preserves, interprets, and shares the diverse history and culture of San Francisco's West Side. But colloquially, we're known as your friendly neighborhood history project. We do all kinds of things. We do history walks, history talks, pub crawls, trivia nights. We have websites. We do programs like this that make videos available online. And we do it all with friends. And in support of that work, we also, to make sure we're a branding nightmare, launched a citywide photo archive called OpenSF History in 2014 that has photos from the 1850s all the way to the 1990s. You'll see some of those photos here today. And we also help Gary Stark manage cliffhouseproject.com, which is the biggest photo repository for all things Cliff House and beyond. So we get up to lots of good work. You can find all of that here on this website, wnpsf.org, which we launched this year. And boy, was that really something. And if you like the work that we're doing, then we encourage you to donate. You can do that in the URL below on our YouTube channel, or you can slide on over to outsidelands.org/give. Every little bit helps us do programs like this and so much more, including all the rest of the programming at Shipwreck Week that I'll get into much later. But today, we're so lucky to have three experts in the room with us, and I'll let them take it from here. So, Steve, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself first.
Hi, thanks, Nicole. I'm Steve Haller. I started work with the National Park Service in 1974 on Alcatraz, where I gave 3 tours a day. That's me on the left, awaiting the next boatload of tourists, and me on the right when I realized we were on camera. The National Park Service was a great career for me. I was in there for 42 years, and that's where I met both of these guys, John and Jim. John actually helped train me, give tours of Alcatraz, and Jim made me realize how little I knew about maritime history as soon as he showed up on the High Street Pier, which is where we met in the milieu of the historic ships out there. Next.
John.
Hi, I'm John Martini. This is a very young me, taken about the same time as the picture of Steve on Alcatraz. I started in January 1974 on the island, giving tours, 3 tours a day, up and down. And during my off times, I would be crawling through the underground areas and the attics on the island, literally on the ground, archaeology, hands-on. I was a total newbie, but I stood on the shoulders of giants later on, and have had the opportunity to work with esteemed professionals like Steve and Jim for many years. I was in for 25 years, couldn't take being unemployed, so came back as a volunteer a week later, and I've been volunteering and being a ranger now for over 40, oh my God, 50 years. Jim?
Well, I'm Jim Delgado. I'm a maritime archaeologist and an historian. I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, moved to the city in 1978 when I joined the National Park Service, where I met both of these guys who helped train me and get me better introduced into life in the National Park Service. The photo is actually John in uniform at the Arizona Memorial with our good friend Burl Burlingame and me as at that stage, the National the National Park Service's maritime historian when I was in Washington, D.C. But back in San Francisco, yes, I worked with Steve at Hyde Street Pier with the historic ships, John at Aquatic Park, and then we all connected again in various parts of the park when I was the park historian. And it was there that Steve and I were able to work together to not only write up an important study for the park and for NOAA, but to then take that and create a book that still remains a favorite, Shipwrecks of the Golden Gate. It's always a pleasure to see these guys. I now live on the East Coast, but San Francisco remains firmly in my heart, just as strong and as powerful as my friendship is for these two brothers.
Friends for over 45 years, right?
Absolutely.
And
And there, you can see there I'm in the middle with my uniform on in that case, yes. But the only guy clean shaven back in those days.
are you three willing to share what you informally call yourselves off camera?
Jim?
You've got me stumped there. What
you alluding
is
to?
that? The three amigos?
Yeah.
Oh, these guys, I don't know, we've always known each other by first names. When we were in uniform, occasionally, I mean, we'd call each other on the radio and it'd be 103, 502, you know, that kind of stuff. But nah.
If you mean nicknames, I may be the only one in the group. I had a nickname when I was on Alcatraz. I was
Right.
called, because of my interest in military history, I was called Cannonball Martini.
When I joined the Park Service, I was 20. So to some people, I'm still known affectionately as the boy historian, though it doesn't really fit very much anymore. Now it's the grandpa historian.
Yeah.
Well, I think we have the drink for Shipwreck Week 2025. It's going to be a Cannonball Martini.
Excellent.
A really big
Nicole.
olive. Yeah.
Yeah, really big. We'll just throw them in so there's a big splash. Well, thank you, three of you, for being here today. It's always a delight to be in the room, even if it's a Zoom room with you. And your book, Shipwrecks at the Golden Gate, another shameless plug before we get into this, can be purchased at the W&P shop. Just go to our website, outsidelands.org, and it'll be right there. And look at that.
Here it is.
Steve graciously delivered boxes of these to my house last year, and it's one of our best sellers still. So what do you think, history friends? Are you ready to get on with this show?
Let's get wrecked.
Excellent. So we'll start with a bit of an overview of like why shipwrecks happen here, if that's okay.
Lots of ships came.
John, take it away.
They're all trying to squeeze into this little teeny opening. The entrance to San Francisco Bay, what we call the Golden Gate. It's basically it's a funnel. It's a funnel in one direction of all the rivers in the northern part of California that empty into the San Francisco Bay, various tributaries, rushing out through this mile-wide gap in the coastal mountains. And when the tide changes, it's the Pacific Ocean trying to force its way in. The currents are just hideous. Fog frequently obscures the harbor entrance. And from the earliest times of European colonization, ships have been piling up on the rocks. In fact, the first ship ever to enter San Francisco Bay, first recorded ship, the Spanish packet boat San Carlos, when trying to get out the Golden Gate after surveying the harbor for several weeks, she wrecked on the rocks in the Marin Headlands, had to put into what we call Horseshoe Cove. We do not know what the native people called the Golden Gate. We know that the Spanish, they didn't wax very eloquent. They'd simply call the opening to the harbor La Boca del Puerto, or if they wanted to use more syllables, La Entrada del Puerto, the mouth of the harbor. It was a Yankee name, Golden Gate, that was first given well before the gold rush by explorer John C. Fremont. But the Golden Gate is as we know it.
Before you leave this slide, want to point out in the lower right foreground, you see some flotsam, some maritime flotsam that could likely be from a damaged ship or even a shipwreck. This looks like a mast with the top floating around there in the ocean, a hazard to navigation.
Do you have that great quote?
Yeah, back in as early as 1862, a San Francisco newspaper had the reminiscence of an old salt who waxed on about the causes of shipwrecks. And he claimed a great many wrecks were caused solely by human error, although we'll go into the fact that the current, as John mentioned, the currents, the fog, the fact that the prevailing wind pushed you onto the shore, all that stuff contributed to shipwrecks. But as far as the human side, he listed neglect of the lead, which meant failure to take soundings in an era before sonar, the ignorance of the direction of the currents, mistaking the land, collision, employment of pilots who are not seamen, shaving the headlands too close, or rounding them with the on an offshore wind, an onshore wind. So it's just a few of the causes.
I think it's important just in terms of connecting this to today. Imagine that this is an interchange on the big ocean highway, and all of a sudden here's the off-ramp as well as the on-ramp, lane by lane. And you got all this traffic coming in and going out. During the gold rush, hundreds of ships arrived, and in some cases, dozens a day. When the port boomed in the 1870s, 80s, and into the 1890s, that traffic picked up. So with that, there's all sorts of opportunities to get into trouble because it's crowded. But there's also this other factor, which is you tend to, just as you're leaving home, you're backing out of the driveway, or you're getting ready to pull in, or you're going into a parking lot. There's a lot of things that are distracting you. Or perhaps you're just a little relaxed.
Mm-hmm.
End of the voyage, end of the trip's about to be there. Or you've just had your first cup of coffee and you're on your way. The majority of car accidents happen within a mile of home. Just ask your insurance agent. And to that, it's the same factor for shipwrecks. Most shipwrecks happen within proximity of a port and within a mile or two of land.
Good, next one. Here's a chart of the harbor entrance. Yeah. What year is this one, Jim?
This is the 1870s, but what's important is that this is a chart done by the U.S. Coast Survey. And to back up a bit, the Coast Survey today is still around. It's part of NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. In those days, the Coast Survey had been established by President Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson, to chart the coasts to better improve the lot of mariners, but in particular because it meant the economy. Most everything came by ship. And we certainly saw that in San Francisco, not only during the gold rush, but all the way up into modern times. And if you think they still don't, just look over across the bay into Oakland. They're still coming. All of these ships coming in and out needed accuracy. Steve talked about what the old salt had said about the headlands here and the winds there. The Coast Survey guys, particularly George Davidson, who came out just at the time of the gold rush, took lots of notes. They made lots of detailed surveys, and those surveys created the charts. Today, we look at Google Earth, Google Oceans, and we think, okay, that's all I need. What most people don't realize is that the work that these guys started doing as early as 1820 on the East Coast and through the gold rush and beyond on the West Coast is the underlying layer of data that is Google Earth and Google Oceans today. So that's where these charts all come from these guys sailing in and out and mapping everything in 1848, 49, 50, 51, and beyond. But Davidson, the guy who would ultimately not only pull all that together and write the Coast Pilot, basically the user's manual for how to navigate the coast, made this chart to demonstrate how many shipwrecks happened. And that's where it gets particularly interesting, because all sorts of lines are drawn and names are written in. And what's important to remember is that these are not just the names of ships that wrecked and sank and remained in place. This is everybody that went bump against each other or hit the shore. They may have had their ship pulled off or salvaged, but it's still there. And what Davidson has done on one of the copies of this chart at the Bancroft Library is he's listed the loss. That is what it cost the economy or what the insurance loss was of either cargo or ship. And this was very important for one key reason, not only to help them sort of figure out insurance rates, but this was also something that was used to make a case to Congress saying, this is hurting the economy, this is hurting tax revenues, you need to pay. And that means we need an appropriation for this lighthouse or for this harbor tug or for this lifesaver. All of these things factored into it. And so this chart's actually an amazing artifact, not just about the shipwrecks, but about the response to shipwrecks and how some things never change. Congress never gives you enough money, and you always got to come back, not just with facts, but with some embarrassing graphics like this sometimes.
Good one. Before we move on, so the Davidson notes you're referring to, just for those who are not familiar, that's the red annotations out there, right, Jim?
Yes.
And the second
Yes, and there's a lot of them.
That this fellow Davidson his name is commemorated to this day in San Francisco on the top of one of the high peaks. Mount Davidson is named after him.
Yes.
Next one.
Thanks for pulling it back to the west side, Steve.
Yep, west side.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A more modern map. This isn't a navigation chart. This is a detail of a turn of the century, turn of the 20th century, that is, showing the Golden Gate Straits, the entrance, and the location of prominent features even today. Yes, I found it fascinating that during the gold rush era, directions to navigators entering the Golden Gate were essentially, as you sail up the San Mateo coast, the landmark you're going to want to look for that you're approaching the Golden Gate are the Seal Rocks, the white guano-covered rocks off Point Lobos, and you were to go a couple of leagues further north and then turn right, and you'll see Alcatraz ahead of you and the headlands of San Francisco and Marin on the other side. Aim for Alcatraz. If the fog's in, drop your anchor. Don't even try it. This was the reason that eventually lighthouses and foghorns would be established around these bluffs to safely guard the ships in, as Jim said, not just, it's the right thing to do, but also there was a monetary purpose. Next one. Oh, the NOAA survey.
This is something, when I left the National Park Service, I was a maritime museum director for 15 years and then went back to the government and joined NOAA. Those folks who still have the Coast Survey as part of them, but I worked in the Office of National Marine Sanctuaries as the director of NOAA's Maritime Heritage Program. One of the things that we were able to do, and we'll talk about this a little later, was to do a more comprehensive survey, building off of some of the work that Steve and John and I had all participated in the park days, to look for shipwrecks. But as well, the Coast Survey's work continued in the 20th and 21st centuries with ongoing surveys. This is all sonar data put into different hues and colors to give you a sense of depth. So the blue that's the deep part. That's at the gate. That's where all the force of the tides going in and out, and the current scours that out. But what you also see is all the mud and sand on the bay side, but also the waves of sand washed out through the gate down below, and tucked in there in different spots, there be shipwrecks, to sound like an old salt. And there's a few that we'll look at later.
Next. I love this view, the Golden Gate before the bridge, taken in the late 1880s. This shows a three-masted schooner being pulled out the Golden Gate by a tugboat. Because the winds are predominantly westerly, coming out of the west, Sailing into the harbor isn't that hard. Getting out can be a big problem, especially in the days of sailing ships before they were actually powered. Uh, Mariners had to resort to tacking, sailing close into the wind and sailing back and forth, zigzagging to keep the wind on their beam to slowly beat their way out the Golden Gate. Starting in the gold rush, steam tugs on the West Coast, they'd offer their services to simply haul you straight out. And that's what's happening here. You can see he's raising the foresail, the small tug. Probably when they get to about Point Bonita, will drop the tow line. And this procedure, this will enter into some of the recce type events we're going to be talking about in just a minute. This trying to get out the Golden Gate. If it wasn't for the tides and it wasn't for the wind, it was the fog.
One thing to notice, by the way, is that this is an experienced captain and crew. He's got a sail coming up on his foremast, and it's rigged in between the gaff and the booms of that foremast. And what he's doing is he's getting himself ready if he needs to tack, as John said. He's already got some sail up and it's hanging loose. I've sailed these types of ships, and so all you do is loosen a line. Excuse me, that thing swings around, catches the wind, and that foresail, well, it's not a foresail, but that one particular bit of canvas is going to help move you about. He's getting ready perhaps to put more up. I think he's got that there now, just in case something happens with the tug. And so at the moment the tug drops the tow line, they're ready to start putting up other canvas, but still have some maneuverability.
Now, two other details about this, which are very telling. It seems like a relatively calm day out there, and but the placid looks are a little bit deceiving in a couple of ways. One is the current. And you could see a band of a different colored water there, just beyond the schooner that goes across the photograph, and that's indicating a tidal rip. That's indicating a current going in one direction or the other, and you could get caught in that cross current and swung around. And one of the wrecks that's just coming up happened because of that exact thing. The other thing is that light winds or no winds at all can actually get you into a whole lot of trouble in that situation. These sailboats didn't have auxiliary engines, and when they cut loose from the tug and got in the wrong kind of current, they could be pushed ashore. So it wasn't just high winds and storms that caused shipwrecks, but sometimes being becalmed, especially or primarily in the sailing era.
Okay.
Next slide.
So this is Land's End. This is the rugged, the untamed northwestern corner of San Francisco, and it contrasts with Ocean Beach to the south and the inner harbor past Fort Point out to the left on this view, which is going to be to the east. This area has snagged so many wrecks over the years. It's partly because those instructions to mariners said to be sure to hug the coast as you're entering, especially on the south side. Well, there are rocks out there, and one reason that this area is called Land's End is because the extreme rocky western tip of Old England in Cornwall is Land's End. It's where the land ends. And for California, for San Francisco, this is where the land ends. Next stop, Hawaii. Next slide.
I will say right before we go to the next slide, the reason why Shipwreck Week exists is because we noticed a lot of wrecks off Land's End were happening in October. And we were like, maybe there should be an entire week where we talk about shipwrecks right here. So that's the origin story of Shipwreck Week.
Thank God Gordon Lightfoot didn't live in the West Coast, because then we'd have a song about that and it would be the Gales of October coming early. Just saying.
That's one of my favorite albums, Jim.
That's a great song.
Yeah.
I
The
included
Edmund Fitzgerald, the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, right? Isn't that what it
Yeah.
is? Yep, yep.
I included this photo because it's famous among California historians and maritime historians. Taken in 1853 from what's now Rincon Point, this whole area in the foreground is now buried under the south of Market and the financial district in San Francisco. This is old Yerba Buena Cove. During 1849, the first year of the California gold rush, when it was its most intense, historians like Steve and Jim have calculated 777 ships entered San Francisco Bay, and a huge percentage of them just never left. They were chartered for one-way voyages around Cape Horn to the gold country, and the first place you could drop anchor, discharge your passengers and cargo, was in this little sheltered cove, Yerba Buena Cove, on the eastern side of the San Francisco Peninsula. A lot of the sailors just abandoned ship once the crew and cargo were gone. Heck, some of them abandoned ship before the crew and the cargo were discharged. And you guys might want to correct me, but I've been told there's over 300 abandoned ships at the height. And this photo shows a tremendous number of them. Yeah, they're not waiting for cargo to go out. They're derelicts.
Over 100 of them were actually turned into floating buildings because San Francisco didn't have enough real estate. That problem seems to have persisted for quite a long time. But with that, they were hotels, the town jail, restaurants, saloons, you name it. But the biggest function that most of them occupied was stowing cargo. They were warehouses, floating warehouses called storeships. The storeships, for the most part, disappeared as the harbor began to develop more fully, as land filled out the old part of the cove, starting from where the pyramid building is today and going all the way out to, of course, today's line of the Embarcadero, a line that would have gone further if the state legislature hadn't stepped in and said, San Francisco, you need to stop filling. Otherwise, Oakland would honestly be a suburb. So to that end, when they got all those ships out, they moved them over to this part of Yerba Buena Cove, where systematically, literally right where that ship is in the middle, there's a little bit of a building showing there. A guy named Charlie Hare, who'd come out in 1850, worked with the local Chinese community, whose fishing village was at that spot, and they systematically tore apart over 100 of these ships to recycle them.
You can see, Jim, the one of those storehouse ships on the far left of the photograph.
Yes, and it still has storage painted on it. There's another one there, and then off on one side of the cove is another one, probably the old Panama, with a big sail made into a tent hanging over the stern, roughly about where the biggest skyscraper south of Market is today. I was able to help dig up a number of these ships, starting with the Niantic, which was the first pulled ashore in 1978. We excavated it at Clay and Sansom Streets and a number of others. But here at Hare's Old Yard, digs consistently kept hitting them. The last being a vessel that we were able to identify as the Arctic whaler Candace, which had not sailed in during the gold rush, but was as old as the other ships, which came in, and Hare bought it in 1859 and didn't finish breaking it up. And so folks who live in town may remember the back end, the stern of that ship, being excavated about a dozen years ago. Just once again, the bones of a ship from the mid-19th century emerging from the mud of the landfill that now, of course, is much of downtown.
Cool.
Go ahead, Nicole. So I made this as a handout for a walk that I led around Land's End, and it shows the rough locations of just some of the major wrecks that I could get my hands on. And as Jim said, a wreck doesn't necessarily mean that it's bones are moldering under the sand. Some of these, they were damaged, they went on the rocks, but they were able to be pulled off. But many of them are still there. And we'll go through the most significant of these. This is an example of why, beginning in 1854 on Alcatraz, the what's called the Lighthouse Board began to erect lighthouses to illuminate the California coast. And the first handful of lighthouses were like the one at lower left on Alcatraz. They actually came as little prefab kits, and a ship dropped off the kits that included like the windows, the door frames, the interior floors, the lantern room at various locations along the California coast, and local materials were used to construct the actual lighthouse structure. The one on Alcatraz, there was a twin down, still standing at Point Pinos, another twin down in San Diego. There were, I believe, at least 5 of them. The Alcatraz one doesn't survive. It was rebuilt in 1909, but it was followed by other lighthouses illuminating the entrance to the bay. Fort Point, Point Bonita at upper right. Next slide. Okay. Fort Point at lower right. These are all 1850s. The last major one was built in 1906 on the perilous Mile Rocks, just off of Land's End. We'll talk in a sec about the wreck of the ship Rio de Janeiro. It was believed that if this particular site had been lighted at that time, when the Rio sunk in 1901, the tragedy might have been avoided. We know now this isn't where she hit, but the thinking was, got to illuminate Mile Rocks, make sure ships don't get too close to the Land's End area. So it took about a year of construction to build this. The workers had to be tied down to the rock because the waves would periodically roll over them while they were constructing the base of the tower. And Mile Rocks Lighthouse, it's still there. It's still a landmark of the Western Neighborhoods Project, although unfortunately cut down the top, well, let's call them the top three stories and the glass lantern. Those were removed in 1965, but it's still an active aid to navigation maintained by the Coast Guard.
Yeah, Peter Hartlaub recently became fascinated with this lighthouse. And so there's a whole article he wrote for the San Francisco Chronicle, and our podcast, which drops on Friday, gets into this history a little bit as well. But now we get to go into the specific shipwrecks, which is going to be my favorite part of today. Are you guys ready to talk about the Viscata?
That's enough backstory, huh?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I'll start, I guess. The Viscata was an iron hull cargo carrier. The early example, I guess you'd say, of what became known as windjammers. An English ship carrying grain, California grain, to and from England in exchange for manufactured goods dropped off in California. And she's an example of she wrecked when she was being towed out to sea. In similar circumstances to that photograph we lingered on of the schooner with the sails being shaken out under tow by the tug. She attempted to tack back and forth, but basically blew it, failed to do so properly or in adequate time. There seemed to be a great deal of confusion about dropping anchors and the like. When second anchor was to be dropped, the ship was in sort of broadside to it and was positioned to just get fouled by the anchor chain. The upshot of it was that she ran ashore at Baker Beach, and this is the north end of Baker Beach, thoroughly salvaged. There was even, as I recall, argument. Jim, you remember this argument over the salvaging of the cargo,
Yeah.
which and who owned what, which led to the fact the cargo not getting salvaged and being totally wasted as the breakers rolled in and the ship was destroyed. We have a really nice description of the scene in Shipwrecks of the Golden Gate. So we go back and plug the book, I guess, if I give you a quick read of this. And as the wreck deteriorated, the newspapers say that the scene at the time was magnificent. Huge rollers coming in with military precision and regularity lifted their crests with a mighty roar and hurled themselves upon the fated ship as if determined to destroy her utterly. while the sea and shore were strewn with her timbers, deck planking, and such portions of her cargo as had not yet been taken from her, notwithstanding the rain that poured down unceasingly. Many persons rode out from the city to witness the scene, and the bluff and the beach were covered at times with spectators. Ambulance chasers like that seem to be a recurring theme of shipwrecks, sort of a, not only spectacular, but perhaps morbid attraction.
It always amazes me that you could have gone down to the Embarcadero where these ships were tied up and walked right up to them, almost could have touched them, and it was just part of the normal San Francisco scene. That was in fact, it was kind of a funky part of the waterfront. Make the damn thing wash up on the beach, and a huge crowd appears. It's just something, I guess, so out of context. Hey,
Well,
let
San
me
Francisco was a
make this relevant and contemporary. Where the Viscata is stranded here, this is the very north end of Baker Beach, or Baker's Beach, for Paul Judge, if he's listening. He's very insistent I use the historic pronunciation. That's where the first couple of Burning Mans took place, in the lee of that bluff on the right, before the Park Service evicted them, and they ended up going to La Playa, Nevada.
You might want to go to the next slide.
We have an entire
You had something to
podcast on
say, I
that.
think, but yeah.
A little.
Jim, were you about to say something?
Well, I think I was just going to make a comment about the nature of the city back then, as opposed to now. But with this, just one thing to note is that little tiny schooner, they backed up to it. They're probably trying to get a little bit of salvage off through the hatches. And at this point, Viscata is still up, not too far off on the keel. The surf is starting to pound against it. And what's happening with that, of course, is that is washing sand out, helping it roll over further. You'll also note in the first photo, the mainmast, the one in the middle, had fallen. You only had the foremast, but the mizzen, that's the one towards the back, folks, had just started to lean over. So the photos, and people were constantly showing up and taking pictures, even then, as today, if something would come ashore, give us a sense of the progression of how quickly these things could be battered apart, even in the absence of a big storm. But back to your point, John, San Francisco had started as a maritime city. I mean, Telegraph Hill got the name because that station was put up there, not so much to guide ships in, but to tell everybody else in town that a ship was coming in, ring the bell, run up the signal arms to suggest what type of vessel it was, and fly the flag, and everybody rushed on down to the waterfront. So much so that today what we call the waterfront back then wasn't referred to as the waterfront. They called it the city front, a very different play on words as to them really feeling that there was their city facing the water. And as mariners came in, they were coming to the city. Fascinating sort of sense of it all. And today, while we don't always think of San Francisco as a water city, as it's no longer, the great port, it really was back then, and everybody was proud of that.
Yeah, that's a great point about the city front as opposed to the waterfront, Jim. Also, so to sort of sum things up, 2 points about this wreck is probably should have had the slides in swap the order, because this was taken before the other one. But this one was taken by the famous photographer, Carlton Watkins, and you could see that over there on the left, this stereo view was one of the ones that he took around the time he was doing his famous work documenting the city with panoramic views and documenting Yosemite National Park before it was a national park.
He actually visited the wreck site a couple of times. That previous photo was also taken by Carlton Watkins.
Okay.
So, yeah,
it
was, I guess, such an attraction. They wanted to get it from start to finish. Yeah. What's the next one coming up, Nicole?
We've got the Frank Jones coming up. And shameless plug, we have podcasts on Carlton Watkins and on Burning Man, which I think there would having a shipwreck installation at Burning Man, I would like to make a plug for that because I think that would go over very well with burners.
Yes.
People first getting into maritime history tend to confuse this ship, the Frank Jones, which wrecked 9 years later, with the Viscata. The Frank Jones was her hull was shaped differently, but most importantly, she was a wooden hulled ship, and her saga was like, if anything can go wrong, it will. She was being towed out the Golden Gate. The skipper was, taking advantage of a tug service, and as they got into the gate, the tow line parted. It's like, okay, well, send another line over, which they did. They resumed the tow. That one parted. So then the captain ordered the anchor to be dropped. But it's some cases, it's almost 300 feet deep in the center of the channel. The anchor couldn't grab bottom. So the skipper ordered the sails set. And before they could get any canvas, boom, she was on the beach between where the Viscata wrecked at Baker's Beach and Fort Point. This is the area some people now call Marshall's Beach. Next.
That type of ship, by the way, just looking at it, guys, that's the typical American sailing ship of the post Civil War period. They're called Downeasters because most were built in Maine, but some, further down east into Massachusetts. Big, large capacity, built for carrying big bulk cargoes. These ships would last into the early 20th century, and they're the last big expression of American wooden shipbuilding as foreign ships come in, and the American flag, never really fully recovered from the Civil War, basically leaves the ocean in favor of the type of ships that Viscata represented, as well as others, and in time steamers.
Yeah, this is the type that would be classically called a windjammer, isn't that right, Jim?
Yeah.
Yeah. You can also notice the flume that carried water to help me out, John, down to Aquatic Park.
Yeah,
You
there was
can
a
see
pump
the
station.
course of the flume over on the right of the cliff, the left of the cliff there.
Yeah, the retaining wall right there at the bocce ball courts at Aquatic Park was built there to help house that pump station for that. The Bensley Water Company, founded during the end of the gold rush, used this flume to take water in. There was a pipe also from Mountain Lake that tried to replace water that used to get hauled over in barrels and sold by guys who would draw them through town on wagons to households.
Nicole, an idea for a future podcast. Let's do the desperate measures San Francisco went to get water from the Presidio to downtown.
Yes.
Yeah.
Water in San Francisco is one of the most fascinating early stories here. And you know what? Do us a favor here, guys. Can you explain maybe what this part of San Francisco was like when these wrecks were happening?
Well, it's probably a pretty good photo to answer that question. Maybe you said that on purpose, but I'd rather leave that to John or Jim.
I'll take this part. It was a tourist destination. There really wasn't much beyond Larkin Street at that point. It was referred to as the outside lands or some of the Great Sand Dune Waste, but it did have a couple of attractions, one of which was the Great Ocean Beach. And people would make their way by buggies and horseback over rude roads through the sand dunes, either through the Mission District or through the Presidio, to get to the Ocean Beach area. Why? Big thing was running your carriage or your blooded horses up and down at top speed on the hard packed sand. I like to say when I give tours that we are not the first generation to have a need for speed. Where today you drive your Dodge Charger. In those days, you'd have your matched four in hand running up and down Ocean Beach. And because the beach was an attraction, so was alongside the beach, watching the seals on seal rocks, sea lions, and a series of roadhouses popped up along this desolate stretch of shore because you had to drink every couple of hours. you needed alcohol refreshment. And these were generally named after geographic locations. There was one near Lake Merced called Lake House, another at the foot of Ocean Beach near what's now the zoo called Ocean House. And there was one on top of the cliff overlooking the Seal Rocks called the
Cliff House.
Cliff House. There you go.
You also notice in the lower left is a hint of some sort of shipwreck. There's a couple of shipwrecks right early on the site. You can see an anchor sticking out of the sand.
Well, you had the Brig Nardello, you had the Chateau Palmer, you had a couple of early wrecks there, right by the point, as well as further down the beach. One of the earliest ones was actually the Revenue Marine.
Right.
That would be the Coast Guard. They lost their ship, the Cornelius W. Lawrence, very early on Ocean Beach.
And so it's sparsely populated out here. When wrecks happened, who would be responding to save the individuals and the cargo from these wrecks?
Initially, nobody. Maybe if you're lucky, some of the local residents, or maybe if you wrecked in the Presidio, maybe the military would come out. But there was no Coast Guard in those days, not during the 1850s and the 1860s. The U.S. Life Saving Service was organized in the early 1870s on the East Coast and on the Great Lakes. And this was government funded, just like Lighthouses, to carry out rescue operations on the Atlantic seaboard, on the Great Lakes. And in 1877, they opened the first one in San Francisco on Ocean Beach because there were so many vessels getting into distress. And because it was in the brand new Golden Gate Park, it was called the Golden Gate Park Station, later shortened to the Golden Gate Station. A rescue boat station consisted of a boathouse with a surf boat. These were rowed by hand by those sturdy guys in the center foreground. There would be a residence for the chief keeper of the rescue station, and there would be a dormitory where the guys, I don't think they lived there full time, but that's where, like firemen, when you're on call, you live at the station for a few days. And the old expression was, if a ship gets in distress, you got to go out. You don't have to come back.
And we'll get into the nuances of the life-saving service more later, but isn't there still a piece of this station left on the west side, John?
Yeah, the chief keeper's house, which is a little bit different structure than the one shown in this photo. The chief keeper's house was moved, I believe, in the late 1910s when a newer station was constructed. They remodeled the whole facility, the Golden Gate Station. And the chief keeper's house was bought by a former surfman who had served at the station. It was relocated to 47th and Cabrillo.
That feels right.
Yeah.
It's bright purple. You can't miss it now.
Some of the ships that we're going to talk about, they were so nondescript, so common. We don't even have photographs of them before they became infamous by wrecking. One of them was the whaler Atlantic. And this is Jim, is this a replica or is this a restoration of a Boston whaler?
That is Charles W. Morgan.
Oh, she's a rich, yes, thank you.
Yep.
National Historic Landmark, and I'm lucky enough, I actually I had a trick at the helm sailing her when she was restored.
Right.
The last American whaling ship left afloat dates 1836.
She managed to wreck herself on Ocean Beach in 1886.
No. Yeah. Right, not the Morgan, but the Atlantic.
Yeah.
Yes.
Go on.
Well, and you can see the fury of the waves that you've got the full reach of the Pacific just striking the shore. As we all know, when you're down on Ocean Beach, particularly in those days, what was it? Bret Hart referred to those waves as like lines of wolves running up onto the shore. And it just literally tore Atlantic apart.
She's another example of being towed out to sea and the wind died. And that's what killed her. The wind died and the current. And when she drifted ashore, you could see the tremendous damage that was done. This was a costly shipwreck. This one's not funny. 43 men on board, only 11 survived, and it's the worst disaster in terms of loss of life that occurred on Ocean Beach. There's much blame went around. The ship was considered to be in poor condition. The captain apparently was found to have not exercised proper judgment and casting off from the tug too early while the ship was still inside the San Francisco bar. And apparently didn't alert the men in the forecastle, sleeping men in the forecastle early enough. So he was censured and skipped town before he could be, I guess, fully punished.
Give me a location. Where would this be geographically today?
This is real close to, this is the Atlantic, the Reporter, and the King Philip are all clustered together. Jim, maybe you could fine tune that, but it's basically around Noriega Octavia Street.
Ortega.
Yeah, I was gonna say probably closer to foot of Moraga. There's a large magnetic anomaly that we suspect is what's left of this wreck. A magnetic anomaly, folks, is shipwrecks with all the metal fasteners, even if they're buried deep in sand or underwater. Magnetometer is an instrument we use to locate shipwrecks, and it will give us a reading. And we use those to determine, and there's a very strong shipwreck signature about that spot. And at one stage, a piece of what we believe to be Atlantic came out and was exposed on the beach, just as we've had exposures of other wrecks there. What's important to remember is why a whaling ship here. San Francisco had become the great whaling port of America. It had started on the East Coast, but shifted to San Francisco. The Pacific, when it had opened up after the War of 1812, had long seen Hawaii dominate that, but with San Francisco as a protected anchorage, many whalers ultimately relocated and would seasonally go out from San Francisco, work the Northwest coast, and then into the Arctic, up along the coast of Alaska and further in. And that's what Atlantic was doing, or on its way to do, when it was lost.
And the next wreck that we have is actually one of the only ones with a brass plaque on the cliff house to let people know what had happened at the site, and that's the Parallel.
Yeah, we don't have a real photograph of the Parallel. Again, so this is a stand-in photo. The Parallel was a little two-masted schooner, plied the California coast. As Jim called them, they were the long-haul truckers of their day. Some cases, like in this particular photo, they carried lumber. They could also carry any type of cargo. Well, the Parallel had a very specific type of cargo. She was trying to get out the Golden Gate. It spent over a day trying to beat her way, tacking out the Golden Gate without a lot of success. Her cargo was not much problem. Dynamite, kerosene, and blasting caps. She got in such distress that the crew abandoned her. And they managed to row into Sausalito, never bothering to tell anybody what they'd left behind floating around out there. The Parallel went on the rocks below what we now call Point Lobos. And she went boom. She blew up early in the morning. People had seen her on the rocks, and they could tell there was no crew aboard. So they left a couple of life-saving service guys on the bluffs to protect the wreck, from looters. And when she unexpectedly blew up, they still don't know the exact cause. The life-saving guys were blown dozens of yards off their feet. Part of the cliff house was blown up. Here, the carriage sheds. This is taken the next morning. And thousands of people poured out to take a look at the destruction. The cliff house operator, they swept up the broken glass, where almost every window had been busted out, and they opened the bar for business, and they just did a land office business of looky-loos, people coming out. There was a embryonic steam train that just parted its passengers down about Balboa and La Playa, and the trains were just jammed all day. People coming to look at the wreck.
The disaster tourism aspect of the shipwreck history here in San Francisco has always really fascinated me because you can just see the lineage of human behavior that doesn't change at all. People are like, oh my God, we got to go see that explosion. And I really, that's been the part I've enjoyed learning about this history. So the next ship that we have is one that frequently, more frequently than the others, sort of exposes herself on the shore.
King Philip is a favorite because it's one of the first wrecks that I was able to work on as a shipwreck archaeologist. We had some strong winter storms that stripped the beach in the early 80s. One of the first wrecks to appear was Neptune, which had washed ashore in 1900, close to what's now Fort Funston, and been beaten apart, and a piece of Neptune's hull had emerged. But then not long after that, both ends, both the bow and the stern end of King Philip showed up. King Philip was a medium clipper, a little different type of ship than the Downeaster I just talked about. But like Downeasters, and as the name implies, King Philip was built in Isle-aux-Maines. It had a sharper sort of a body, hence clipper-like. There's a good painting and illustration of it. It was built for deep sea trade. It went to Australia. It sailed throughout the Pacific and a variety of other ports. But these types of ships, particularly the medium clippers, couldn't carry enough cargo to be economically sound. The whole idea behind clippers and ultimately medium clippers was you put a valuable cargo in and you get to be the first one in port. So whether you're selling tea or anything else like that, you can command a higher rate for shipping the freight. Call them sort of a fast FedEx in their time, but that didn't last long. So King Philip ended up going into the lumber trade and, like all the others, set out past the gate in 1878, but lost the wind, but then got swept in and ended up on the beach on the side where gradually bedding down, King Philip could not budge. Next slide, please. And this is a painting from the time showing it facing in the proper direction pointing towards the Golden Gate. That's the Ocean House that John talked about. And you can see in the foreground, the curved nature of those timber sticking out. That's another shipwreck that had bounded up into the sand and had a few bones sticking out. King Philip never budged. They sold it. A local garbage guy bought it to recycle, took off the mast if they hadn't fallen, salvaged what he could, pulled some of the sheathing that protected the wooden hull from marine worms off, and then left the entire bottom to bed down in the sand. And that's what started to show up in the 80s. Go ahead, next slide. This is at that time when we were doing that work. And you can see her pretty close to the foot of Noriega, bow and stern. And with this, at this time, enough sand had moved off that you could literally go inside the hull. That was pretty fascinating. I actually dived the wreck at this time, which was not unlike, how best to describe it. I might have well just put myself in my dive gear, put myself on the high spin cycle in my washing machine. But just the same, we found a number of things that still had the sheathing on the bottom, and there was a fitting at the stern to help support the rudder because the lines were so sharp that without that reinforcing, those rudders could literally be knocked off at speed. Go ahead, next slide. This is about the way we saw King Philip as it continued to expose. We're really at the level of the tween deck. In other words, about half of the ship is still down there underneath the sand. We did probing. San Francisco Fire Department came out, loaned us a pumper truck. We hooked up a big probe with pressurized water and found that the ship is still in ballast. That is the rocks that helped keep it in trim before they loaded the lumber. But that is the characteristic bow of a medium clipper. Kind of sharp, but still sort of blunt, not like a big wall of wood, as later and earlier ships would be, but with big capacity in a way than a regular clipper, but not big enough. Hence, something like Frank Jones, which, as we saw earlier, was a bigger, more full-bodied vessel. you can see here as well with the surf. That's why it was tough. There's a good picture of the outline of the wreck. And there up at the bow, that's what's called a crutch. It helps reinforce the bow as it meets the waves. That W is most likely because this is a piece of timber that had been carefully selected by the shipwright that built it. His name was Dennett Weymouth. And that's probably having them carve that in as all of these trees are being cut down, and that choice piece of lumber is set aside for Weymouth. That was an interesting, again, proof that we'd found it. And years later, I would go out to Alna, Maine, where she'd been built, just up the Wiscasset River, and go to that site. And the ways, the logs that King Philip had slid down to go meet the water for the first time are still there, well preserved in the mud and the banks of the Wiscasset. Amazing. So yes, King Philip, one of my favorites.
You could see the beautiful grain of that piece and how it's curved just right to be incredibly strong in its position at the bow.
That's why the folks that work restoring ships like this, like the Charles W. Morgan and the C.A. Thayer, and out there challenged to find timber of this quality and this size nowadays.
Yeah. Interestingly enough, a few years back, NOAA was testing equipment in the Gulf of Mexico, and the robotic vehicle dropped down, about 4,000 feet, and landed literally right in front of a shipwreck. And it was about as much of that shipwreck left as is with King Philip. And I got a call, and you can join online through the satellite feed, and we're looking at it. We come up to the bow, and everybody looks at it, and somebody says, "What kind of a bow is that?" And I said, "Well, that's a medium clipper." And they go, "Well, how could you say that?" And I said, "Well, years ago, I was standing on the beach looking at one." Yeah, the funny part, yeah.
Hey.
The funny part, what?
The funny part is that you can't pick this stuff up in books necessarily. It is actually seeing these things. And this is the best preserved example left, because that type of ship is long gone. The best preserved in the country, at least not other than in the deep water, of a medium clipper, which is why we did the nomination, and this wreck is listed in the National Register of Historic Places.
And this is the point where somebody says, "Well, why don't you raise her and restore her?"
Well, because we got perfect examples of other ships that cost a lot of money. And if people realize the tens of millions of dollars that it takes, there's a reason why King Philip coming in and out of the sand every so often gives folks a thrill, an opportunity to connect to the past, for the stories to be told again. And it will continue that way for generations to come, until ultimately climate change-induced storms and the ongoing eating of Ocean Beach will wash her out and take her away.
And if you do come across her when you're walking on Ocean Beach, what should you do or not do, guys?
Don't put a W in it like Dennett Weymouth did. Don't try to take anything off of it. Leave it as you found it, so that anybody else who comes along later can have that same thrill, that same moment of discovery. And there's the fun of it. For generations, people have been able to do this. And that's powerful. For us, when this first peeked out, it was as if we were the first people to have ever seen it, and we knew better. So why not let other people do that? Because I think this is going to be around for decades, if not a century to come.
And if you do find a piece, don't bring it to Western Neighborhoods Project. Bring it to San Francisco Maritime National Historic Park, just as a PSA. All right, you mentioned the Neptune, Jim. Give us the backstory on the Neptune.
Two-masted schooner carrying lumber, washed up onto the beach. Again, just a bad day, some bad navigation, not too much of a storm. Neptune stayed for a little while until a storm broke it up. But right there in those same cliffs just below Fort Funston is where we found one whole side of it. What's interesting is if anybody goes to San Francisco Maritime, the now having just left C.A. Thayer was built by the same guy. So what was interesting is having worked with these guys at the Historic Ships at Aquatic Park at Hyde Street Pier, looking at it, it's like, this looks familiar. Basically, the same guy who built the Thayer, shown here, had built the Neptune. And, well, let's just say it was another deja vu moment, and helped make the case for, yep, it's in the right place and it's built the right way and it's built of the right timber, Douglas fir. This has got to be the Neptune.
You've mentioned a couple times people saying, well, how do you know this is the ship that you say it is? And I'm wondering who has the cojones to ask you, Jim Delgado, how you know what you know about these ships? Because you know so much. You are the authority on this.
No, I make mistakes just like everybody else. I think in some of these cases, what we do is it's a lot of CSI type of work. We don't always get a name, but in some cases we can get a name. What made it easier is, one, the fact that Davidson and his guys in the Coast Survey marked exactly where these things ended up. Two, because they're documented, because everybody pays taxes and the government was registering and licensing these, giving them a number, but also recording how long they were, how wide they were, how deep the hulls were, how much they could carry, what they were built of, all of that. Not for insurance, but because the tonnage, that is, it's a 190-ton vessel, it doesn't mean what it weighs. It means how much cargo it can carry and how much you can tax it for. So you've got all of these references that help you with that. So location, characteristics, all of that factors into it. But in a number of cases, no, you can't always pin a name on the wreck, though. It's a fun game for a lot of folks.
And one of the most historic wrecks that we have here in San Francisco is the city of Rio de Janeiro, which is also one of the most tragic shipwrecks that we have.
Yeah, the city of Rio de Janeiro, she was a steamship, although she still retained masts and sails to augment. Steel hulled, or rather iron hulled. She'd been plying the trade for many years on a regular routine between Yokohama and Hong Kong, the Hawaiian Islands, and San Francisco. And she was coming into port after a gnarly cross-Pacific challenge in February 1901. They came in late, the fog was in, it was dark. They dropped anchor off the Cliff House. And shortly after midnight, the fog seemed to lift and they could see lights inside the Golden Gate. As you know, the fog comes and it goes. It's not a consistent blanket at all. That's my dog. And they decided to take the ship in. The pilot was aboard, the captain concurred. They headed in, and they hadn't gone more than a few miles and they hit a rock. We're still not sure exactly what rock they hit. But unlike Titanic, that bounced off an iceberg and opened her side, the Rio de Janeiro pretty much climbed up on a rock, opening her hull below the waterline and then slid off. And it was over in just a matter of minutes. One historian has described the chaos in a blacked out ship. The electric lights went out, ice cold waters pouring in. Many of the passengers were Asian, didn't speak English. The crew didn't speak Japanese and Chinese. And to cut to the chase, the worst maritime disaster in San Francisco history. There had been 220 passengers and crew. 135 were killed in the catastrophe. She went down so fast that no one was sure exactly where she hit or where she went down. Somewhere around Land's End, Fort Point is all they really knew. Bodies were washing up all along the shore. Italian fishermen were pulling people out of the water, some alive, some dead. The ironic thing is she hit the rocks only maybe within a quarter mile of a life-saving service lookout station above Fort Point. The lookout claimed he didn't hear her. He didn't know what was going on. Soldiers in Fort Point, they said they heard a whistle and screams in the night and then just an eerie dead silence. On the left is the photo of her carrying troops during the Spanish-American War, returning from the Philippines. And Jim, I'll turn this over to you. You found her.
Well, we didn't find her. We relocated her to just to give credit to the folks that searched for her, one of whom was a retired NOAA admiral who knew all about the Coast Survey. The location of city of Rio de Janeiro sinking was really undetermined. She'd struck the rocks. Was it Mile Rocks, which is why they put the lighthouse there? Was it Fort Point Rocks? Nobody really had ever figured it out. I think actually they most likely struck the rock ledges at Fort Point, John. I think they almost had made it through the gate, but in the fog, didn't really know where they were until they hit. The thought of the tide maybe having pulled her in meant many people searched in and around San Francisco Bay. But no, as it turned out, what the admiral had figured out with his guys in the surveys they did pinpointed the wreck off the Golden Gate. They had a beautiful, very nicely defined image of it, free of mud, on its, more or less on its side, lying about 300 feet. That is right in the deepest part of the channel.
When was this, when they did that initial?
We're talking the 80s.
1880s?
No.
1980s.
Ooh, okay.
1980s is when they announced they'd found it. A lot of back and forth over would they be able to. They sent a robot down to look at it, but the currents meant that robot never came back up. So the project really didn't continue. When we were doing a program of different wreck searches and documentation when I was at NOAA, we decided to, as part of this mapping, to go and take a close look. And with that, the data from the NOAA surveys showed it. So we dropped on that spot with a Coda Octopus equipment that had been provided by a local contractor who did that work as a favor. They'd been providing that system to the San Francisco Fire Department, and we were able to image city of Rio de Janeiro again and to pinpoint it. So there it is on its side. One of the reasons people looked for it and why the admiral and his team had searched was the fact that the manifest, that is the list of all the cargo, included the term Chinese silver. And that meant to folks that this was a treasure ship. Unfortunately, what people didn't realize is that the same term, the term didn't mean treasure. The 19th century was particularly racist, and there was a lot of anti-Chinese, as well as anti-Irish sentiment. One of the things I didn't say earlier is when you're a dead calm at sea, sailors used to refer to that as an Irish hurricane. I think you get the point. So Chinese silver, it's tin. So there's a large amount of tin sitting down there, worth something, but not enough. But if you could get to it, today, city of Rio de Janeiro is a mud-shrouded hulk with a lot of those folks who never got out of their cabins sealed inside that tomb.
Jim, along the lines of what you were saying about ethnicity, I think, John, you might have a minor misspoke that the wanted to clarify that much of the crew was Chinese. All of the officers were Anglo. There was a language barrier for sure, which contributed to the likely contributed to the confusion and possibly to the loss of life.
Thank you.
That more recent scholarship indicates, and maybe one of you can illuminate that further, but more recent scholarship indicates that the Chinese crew actually acted quite heroically during the wreck event.
There was a language barrier, but they did. And they also had done earlier with the tragic loss of the city of Chester inside the gate, the second largest disaster, when the incoming liner Oceanic hit it and sank the city of Chester. The Chinese crew acted. And this is at a time when there's a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment in the city.
Exactly.
The Chinese crew, in one case, leapt into the water to save a drowning boy. And the newspapers stopped all the anti-Chinese rhetoric for a while and said, fair enough, best traditions of the sea. Well done. So yes, Chinese mariners had been engaged in trade for some time and were an active part of both the Pacific Mail and a number of the other companies that were going back and forth between San Francisco and the Orient. In the aftermath of the gold rush, San Francisco really had become the port of call for China, Japan, and the Philippines as the great ports in the Pacific as America began to open its doors to not only exploration and trade in those waters to a greater extent, but also San Francisco then becoming the great port of immigration for Chinese coming in.
Right.
Okay. I think next.
Moving on in time, we're going back to Ocean Beach.
Ah, the reporter. Well, the reporter is not built by the same fellow that built the CA Thayer, but is quite similar in size and general aspect as a three-masted schooner. And she is another one of these fellows that met an unfortunate end on Ocean Beach, actually very close to the site of the King Philip. The reporter was approaching the Golden Gate at night. And this is a case of human error where the captain mistook, as the record shows, the captain mistook the light at the Cliff House for the Point Bonita light. So he's actually much further south than he thinks. He's already past the Golden Gate when he turns in. And as a newspaper account of the time put it, and I can be humorous because I believe there was no loss of life here, he tried to hurdle her over the peninsula instead of going in orderly through the harbor entrance.
Yes.
There are omens also about this ship, that the ship sailed on a Friday from Grays Harbor, Washington. And not that Grays Harbor is bad luck, but sailing on a Friday is considered bad luck. And it happened also that the ship's cat, who happened to be a black cat, jumped overboard and drowned an hour before she weighed anchor. And the cook, a superstitious man, was recorded as saying he felt the poor thing committed suicide rather than sailing on a doomed ship. Next slide. Here you can see the bones of King Philip sticking out of the sand as reporter is going to pieces. Her mizzen-mast has gone over the side by now. And,
one of the things, if you look at the photo, you can see the bowsprit. What you can see is the rigging is starting to come apart.
oh yeah,
And
the sail, the jib is shredded. It hasn't.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. And so we'll come back to that in just a second.
Okay.
With all
Shall
of
we
these
go to the next
shipwrecks,
slide?
I've heard that, sailors are superstitious. Was there any kind of particular superstitions related to this part of San Francisco, or can you confirm that the guys are superstitious beyond the cat jumping overboard story?
Sailors are notoriously superstitious. There are ghost stories, not so much on Ocean Beach, but there were old-time sailors that claimed that they never wanted to sail past this, by the gate at fog at night because of the thought of the wreck of city of Rio, and that voices could be heard. On the Marin side, people claimed that they would see the steamer Tennessee as a ghost come up on the beach, though nobody died. Things of that sort. And I did hear one not so superstitious person tell me at one stage they were on Tennessee Beach years ago, and the fog had come in, and all of a sudden they were in a crowd of people talking excitedly and hurriedly, and then it was gone, and they just figured for a moment that it was a ghostly reflection of all the passengers coming ashore when the Tennessee hit the beach on March 6th, 1853. Who knows?
Wow. And if knowing that the life-saving service was there, was that a comfort to the mariners coming through the Golden Gate, or did they not have an opinion on it?
Oh, of course, it was a comfort. The life-saving service was quite heroic at this
Yes.
this particular instance. And the first attempt at at launching a surf boat to rescue the crew of the reporter failed in when the lifeboat swamped in the heavy surf. But the second attempt was successful, and they rescued all hands.
Yeah.
You,
The lifesavers were seen as heroic, and I think everybody understood that generally there was no guarantee for them as well as anybody else with a rescue. So no, it was important, I think, to sailors to see that the lifesavers were there, and always gratitude.
and some of the lengths they went to, there's instances of them hauling the boat cart, like the one in the left in the shadows, over the sand dunes because they couldn't launch at Ocean Beach, hauling it over to Baker's Beach to launch. Incidents where they would row up the coast miles and miles for ships that were stranded almost as far as Point Reyes. These guys, yeah, they earn their pittance. Although you read the period newspapers, just like today, after a disaster, people will say, well, FEMA wasn't there fast enough. You'll hear people, claiming the life-saving service. They took their time. And no, the reality is that it hadn't been for these guys, there would have been huge, well, we'll see more as we come up. They really, they were there. They were omnipresent.
There's one instance, maybe one of you can help me with. I think it's the Elizabeth, which is
Yes.
Marin County shipwreck,
Mhm.
which
Slide Ranch. Yeah, Slide
yes,
Ranch.
yes. And what was it? The surfmen from must have been from Point Bonita.
Yes,
I
they made their way up, Steve, from Point Bonita, practically up to Bolinas, right?
right. And when and in the storm, and it's
Yes.
raining, and
Yes.
apparently when the horses gave out, am I right on this, Jim? The horses gave out. The men strapped themselves to the cart, not the boat here, but they had a heavy life-saving cart with a cannon, no less, on it, and hundreds of yards of heavy line, and they dragged the thing up to, was it Bolinas? Was it?
Well, it's with Slide Ranch. It's with
Slide
Slide
Ranch.
Ranch
Thank you.
on the marine
Slide Ranch.
shore.
Very good.
But no, I mean, and to that end, those Lyle guns fired a projectile that had a line that had been faked out, that carefully wrapped so that it deployed, and that line would be used to pass a heavier line to rig a breeches buoy to let people sit in a canvas chair on pulleys and ride over the waves to get them out.
They had two ways. They
There
could
you
either
go.
launch
Right.
a boat
That's
and row out, or here's an example of the surf cart. These are both from the Golden Gate Park Station. And they would, for demonstration purposes, they would fire a lifeline to a rescue mast mounted on shore like this to demonstrate to the public. And huge crowds would turn out to watch these drills.
you could see.
Go ahead.
The
Breeches.
buoy there in the rigging. So what they have is a practice mast.
Yep.
And you could still see a practice mast cut down, but you could still see the metal steps on either side. I don't know if this one's metal or not, but you can still see the remains of that at along the Presidio shoreline at Crissy Field.
Yeah.
And the rescuee was supposed to get into that breeches buoy and be hauled in over the surf successfully, as you see in this case. It's incredible feat.
One of the more interesting stories, of course, is I think it was the Coos Bay When
Oh.
she hit the rocks. You remember that one, guys?
They fired a Lyle gun from the Coos Bay. They tried to
Ah.
fire it ashore, and I think they overshot the mark.
Yeah, they hit a house at 48th.
Yeah, and it turns out to be just a couple of houses down from the house that's still occupied by a revered activist, credited rightly with helping to found the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. It's Amy Meyer's house is only a couple of houses down from the house that was whacked by the Lyle gun projectile.
Yes.
When they fired the projectile, normally from shore to ship, the people on the ship were supposed to pull over a small line and then a bigger line, and they knew how to rig it up. I imagine in the panic of the Coos Bay going ashore, they kind of forgot their training, and they didn't wait to have the Lyle gun fired at them. They fired, and they did it poorly.
Too big a charge, actually. So
In the Golden Gate station, the boats were launched, pulled by horses right out into the surf. They crossed a great highway. There was a ramp down to the sand. This is Point Bonita, and in here the surf boats. Here's an early powered one. They were kept in a boathouse with on a rail cart, and they could just go by gravity and launch right into the water in Bonita Cove. There were several life-saving stations established. Golden Gate Park was the first. Then came Fort Point. There it is at upper right. They also eventually had a marine railway there. There was one at Point Bonita. There was one at eventually what do we call today Horseshoe Cove at Fort Baker. And then there was the forgotten one, the one at lower left in this photograph. This was called Southside Station, and it was located right about where the water treatment plant is, near the zoo. There's a little corner of Fort Funston, and you have there the abandoned surfman's dormitory on the left. The windows are boarded up, and the boathouse where the surf boat would be launched.
And if you notice the architecture of the boathouse, you can see how standardized some of these things were.
In fact, look at the boathouse and look at the little cupola. And I think the next one, Steve.
Yeah. Next slide is the Fort Point life-saving station. And you can see that's pretty much the same kind of architecture on the left. It's actually an architectural masterpiece inside. If you, it uses storage for maintenance equipment now.
The park has that one. Yes.
Yeah, the park retains that one, although the keeper's residence on the right was once leased to the Gorbachev Foundation in happier times, I guess. I'm not sure who's.
Well, today it's the headquarters for Greater Fairlawns National Marine Sanctuary.
Oh, right. Of course, of course.
Visitor center.
But the boathouse roof, if you go in there and you look up, it's incredible. It's like a Rubik's cube made of wood, holding up the roof, and kind of behind those buildings, on the driveway that leads to the back, is the stub remnants. It's about 20 feet tall now, I guess. That was once that wreck practice pole when the surfmen or the coasties practiced with deploying Lyle gun and breeches buoy. I don't know if we said it in so many words, but have implied, maybe we said it in so many words, but it's worth saying again, that the life savings service and the lighthouse service eventually merged and included the revenue cutter service and became the United States Coast Guard.
1915. Yeah.
The Coast Guard started with the life-saving service and revenue cutter service combined. And then in 1939, they blended in the lighthouse service.
Right.
And that's why you have the Coast Guard doing everything from, taking care of lighthouses and foghorns to doing drug interdiction on the high seas. It's all vestigial from these original missions of law enforcement with the revenue cutter service, life saving, and aids navigation. And they're under Homeland Security now. In time of war, like during World War II, the Coast Guard comes under the direction of the Navy. And the Coast Guard played a serious role in coast protection, especially walking coastal beats during World War II. They had stations at Stinson Beach, one down the San Mateo coast. So they were literally the Coast Guard.
Right. And they played a notable role in, particularly in forming crews of landing craft that,
Right.
for instance, had stormed Omaha Beach were commonly.
They were the little guy in the cockpit and back, right?
Yeah,
Guy in the
and
cockpit
likewise,
back,
yep.
Coast Guardsmen earned the Medal of Honor evacuating Marines at Guadalcanal.
Yeah, they were all
But
throughout
we
the Pacific
digress.
and Vietnam as well. Yeah, so
Next.
they also, during the war, they also manned for the Battle of the Atlantic. They were the guys in the weather ships.
Yes, yes, yes. Next slide.
Not all of the life-saving stations were this grand.
No.
No,
Some of them
It's
were
actually a lookout rather than a life-saving station per se,
Right.
but it's.
Yeah, there were a number of these up and down the coast, and they were manned stations looking out. And by the time this picture was taken, it's one of a series of photos taken at about 1930 of Little Land's End Station. They had also, maybe Jim knows right this, they may have still been using the situation where they would walk the coast between these little stations and the main rescue station, say at Golden Gate Park, and the beach patrol, they carried a token. And when the guys met each other partway through the walk, they'd exchange tokens to make sure they'd actually made their rounds that night. These were kind of little snug lookouts. It probably wasn't the worst of duties. It sure beats rowing out in a storm. And I think, yep, there's a trace remain of it. That's all that's left. There was a twin station to this. I mean, the building was identical on the hill above Fort Point. Got demolished when the Golden Gate Bridge was constructed. And there was one that the life-saving station at Point Bonita, they actually had a tower built into their dormitory to provide them a lookout.
So we know more about the life-saving station and the service that helped respond to these wrecks. Now we can move into the 1920s with the Lyman Stewart.
I'll take that one.
Yes, we can.
A classic early 20th century oil tanker. The Lyman Stewart was built in San Francisco in 1915, and 1914 at the famed Union Iron Works down south of Market. And the U on the funnel stands for United Oil. She was an oil tanker. And amazingly enough, in the fog, she collided with a liner, the Walter A. Luckenbach. And the Lyman Stewart, the Lyman Stewart was a freighter and a passenger. And this is going to keep happening with these next wrecks we're going to discuss. There's no radar yet. It's foggy. You got to look out on the bow. You're listening for foghorns. You're ringing a bell. You're blowing your steam horn. And you pray there's nothing coming in ahead of you. Well, the Luckenbach was headed in, and the Stewart was in the way. And she kind of got T-boned.
And we've got one more photo, this epic photo of the Luckenbach.
Oh yeah, it's just great because you have that, Steve, that's the Trans-Pacific US Navy flight passing her in the foreground.
Yeah, this is actually a very historic moment in aviation history. This is the Luckenbach steamer. A couple of years later, 1925, the United States Navy made the first attempt to fly nonstop from the West Coast to Hawaii. in specially built seaplanes, and that's one of them.
It's also, it's a pre-EPA smokestack too. Funny.
Yeah, and it's pre-OSHA job in the bow. Look at that.
Yes,
Feller who's
exactly.
probably wearing goggles. And can you imagine just sitting there for a flight to Hawaii?
It's like a
Well, I imagine they
labradoodle with
rotated,
like
but
a
the pilot's got to be the
labradoodle
pilot. That's just blows my mind.
So the,
And you thought that sitting in the middle seat in the back of that
Yeah, it
airline
was
plane.
uncomfortable.
Yeah.
I think the next photo shows the yeah, there's the bow of the Stewart after the Luckenbach pulled away, and you could see that you're not going to put a band-aid over that gash. The Stewart was taking on water, and the skipper had basically he had no choice. The ship was going to go down with its cargo and with its crew because they're in the Golden Gate, or he's got a beacher. And he found a small sandy spit. Sometimes we now call it Mile Rocks Beach, near that landmark rock that's still there today called Helmet Rock. And he put her hard aground, thinking hopefully that if the cargo, the oil was pumped off, they'd be able to refloat her. Well, it never happened. This photograph was taken shortly after grounding, the first one. Right. And you can see there's a couple of ships offshore, probably going to help with the rescue. And the Lyman Stewart was there until her remains were finally demolished in the late 1930s, becoming more and more decrepit as time went by. This famous photo here, if you look in the left foreground, you can just make out there's the remains of a rope walk that was stretched between shore to the wreck. It's probably how the sign painters got out there to paint the mother's cookies and cakes ad, and also how the Ku Klux Klan got out there. The Klan was active in San Francisco in the 1920s when this photograph was taken. This is in the late 20s. You see her masts are gone, her funnel's gone. They're never going to refloat her. Periodically, homeless were living aboard her. A reporter visited her in a storm in the early 1930s, right at the height of the Depression, and a whole bunch of former sailors had taken up residence. They moved into the old folks' home. I think the next photo shows her in pieces, broken apart. If you notice in the background, there's a pleasure liner. That's was one of the coastal steamers that went between Los Angeles and San Francisco on a daily run. And there was the wreck of the Lyman Stewart, highly visible as these passenger liners entered the harbor. And before long, there were going to be other wrecks along this section of the Land's End shore, all highly visible. And a historian friend said that to the city of San Francisco, trying to put their best face forward in the 1930s, especially as the World's Fair 1939 to 41 approached, the Golden Gate International Exposition, the last thing you wanted to do was have passengers arriving by ship to San Francisco and witnessing on their way in through the famous Golden Gate the bones of all these shipwrecks. Be akin to flying into SFO, and there's the burned out hulk of a 747 alongside the main runway as you taxi in. No, money was found from the federal government, and in either 38 or 39, what was left of the Lyman Stewart and the other shipwrecks, it was dynamited to pieces. Although there are remains. The ships look like they're just immense and they're going to last forever. Ships are steel ships. They're made of pretty flimsy stuff. Maybe the hull plates are 3/8 of an inch, half an inch thick. The heaviest construction is actually the engine of a steamship. Like the engine block in your car is the heaviest castings in your car. The steam chest and the reciprocating arms of the triple expansion engine of the Lyman Stewart are the only thing that survive from the wreck. The rest of her is just scattered pieces on the bottom, and little bits of that sometimes end up jammed between the rocks that are visible at dead low tide. But this is a pretty visible landmark along the Lands End Trail. And when we take our history walk on Saturday, we're going to be passing this.
Mhm. If we're lucky, we'll be able to see it.
Yeah, the tide does come in and out. This was an exceptionally low tide day.
And you referenced the Coos Bay before, and we can get into her a little bit now too.
Okay.
Don't all jump in it.
No,
Yeah,
former,
those would be the ones.
well, it's a former U.S. Navy collier. That is, it was carrying coal, had been sold surplus, and was converted into what you see there, just as a general freighter when it went ashore.
In the fog.
In the fog, as I
It's all
recall,
fog here now.
yeah, as I recall, she was the sister ship of the Cyclops. Is that not the case? Do I
I
remember
think
that?
you're right.
Yes. Cyclops is a
And-
famous Navy collier that went missing with all hands and remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of the U.S. Navy. But no mystery as to what happened to the Coos Bay.
Yeah, she, again, fog. She was outward bound, and the skipper simply ended up on the rocks. He didn't intentionally do it, but boy, did he do it. Again, they couldn't get her off. This is a great photograph showing the waves smashing against her. It would be a complex move to get a ship off the rocks, let alone in conditions like this, virtually impossible. And Nicole, there's your looky-loos on top of the cliff.
Yeah.
Because that's the old streetcar line. So you could walk out and almost drop a rock onto it. That's why so many of these photos are taken from the same perspective, the old number 1 California streetcar line up there. Okay. And you can see what the waves did to the bow. There's no way this is ever going to be refloated. There's not much left of her. At dead low tide, some of the hull bits, again, pieces of her are wedged in the rocks below what's aptly named Dead Man's Point at Land's End.
Yeah. I've climbed around and through there, and I've seen little chunks of her as well as another that just got washed in, and the plating is just bent into, it's like mangled pieces of a tin can.
Mm-hmm.
And not far away, we've got the Ohioan as well.
Oh yeah, the seamanship on this one is just astounding. Again, it was foggy night, and this would have been in October of 1936. Somehow, the skipper managed to sail her between the Seal Rocks and North Seal Rocks and wedge her into a cove literally 200 yards from Sutro Baths. She was stranded so close to shore that they were actually able to set up the breeches buoy by firing from the cliffs of Land's End. You see the breeches buoy rigged at left and to get right out. Now she was stranded, but she was in such good condition. They really did hope to get her off the rocks. What was she carrying? Washing machines, trucks, general merchandise, tin toys.
Yeah, Christmas presents, stuff for Christmas presents.
Yeah, yeah. No luck. They sadly admitted what they had. A great view of the breeches buoy here, and still see people aboard the wreck. So this is taken within hours of her going on the rocks. They had to admit that she couldn't be refloated, so she was taken over by salvers, and the salvage people were cutting her up inside, and they started a fire with a cutting torch. That was put out, but the wreck was just very quickly reduced by the waves. I think the next photo shows her. Yeah, this photo was taken in early 1938, only about maybe 14 months after she wrecked. The crazy gizmo on the rocks is a Rube Goldberg attempt to harness wave energy, and it was called the wave engine or the tidal engine. And it was a landmark. It was even there when I was a kid, some of it, but it's now disappeared in storms. But you see the Ohioan in this picture here, the next photo, and a really weird thing, in February 1938, a sperm whale washed up on that same little beach. And that crowd of people there is not there to look at the wreck of the Ohio. In this case, they're there to look and, on the left, jump on the sperm whale. They ran special streetcars out carrying visitors with dashboard signs saying, dead whale at the beach. Anything to sell nickels. If you can look closely, there's a bunch of kids jumping on the whale at lower left, and there's a San Francisco cop watching them, apparently trying to hold back the crowd. And today, what's left of the Ohioan? Jim, that's the stern post.
That's the stern post with where the rudder would have been. The boilers are in a row. There you can see them at times as the tide goes in and out. A lot of the machinery was scattered that hadn't been salvaged. Chunks of it. There's one of those boilers. You can see the next one right next to it. That old style. 1, 2, 3, possibly a fourth. So not much, but still a trace. Not a place to dive. I have been there at Flat Calm in the Park Service Zodiac. Not that we told the superintendent.
A don't try this at home kids moment.
You betcha.
Absolutely.
And we also have right nearby the Frank Buck. It's incredible that all these shipwrecks are
go
right
into this one. This is this one's actually in Ripley's in the old booklet, or old not comic strip, but newspaper serial, Ripley's Believe It or Not, because she's the sister ship of the Lyman Stewart, and they wrecked at the same place.
Born together, died together.
Yeah, lived together, died together. Born together, died together.
They were both launched like 50 feet apart from the ways at Union, right?
Yep,
Yeah.
both launched at Union Iron Works now, or now the Bethlehem World War II Bethlehem shipyards, and now a repurposed historic district along the San Francisco waterfront at the edge of the Dogpatch neighborhood. But the Buck, the Lyman Stewart was sort of, I think one of her nicknames was the old lady, sort of had a unremarkable workaday career. The Frank Buck was always involved in a scrape. She actually fought with U-boats during World War I and was remarkably credited with the sinking of a U-boat by a temporarily mounted deck gun aboard. This is another case of fog. So all this cluster of Lyman Stewart, Coos Bay, Frank Buck, Ohio, and wrecked because of fog. She's coming in during the Golden Gate in 1937 when she's rammed by the largest, I think this is the largest American flag ocean liner afloat at the time. The President Coolidge of the Dollar Lines. You can see the dollar on the ship's stacks, funnels. Dollar Line became the American President Line, which lasted for a long, long time. All the ships were named after American presidents. This after the President Coolidge. President Coolidge was outbound with passengers. Here she is, wonderful. This is not the day of the wreck, but the President Coolidge obviously had been through some storms. This also is like all those shipwrecks were at the Golden Gate were not a great advertisement for the coastal steamship lines. I imagine this is not the kind of thing you would want to have on your brochure. For advertising a pleasurable ride to the Orient, as it was called, and back. But on this voyage, disaster struck early in the form of the Coolidge ramming the Frank Buck in the fog just outside the Golden Gate. That's the damage on the President Coolidge's end over there. And this is the damage on the Frank Buck ends. You could see they went right up next to one another, I assume in order to effect some rescue. The newspaper mentioned that where do I have it here? That the luxury liner's rail was lined with attractive society girls and teachers bound for world cruises. Lovely ladies, diplomats, honeymooners, and businessmen were enthralled witnesses to the rescue of the stricken tanker's crew. If you look closely, you could see someone's shoe out there sticking out from the rail of the ocean liner right near where the mast is of the stricken tanker. Evidently, one of the businessmen's foot does not look like the foot or shoe of a delicate society gal. Next slide.
Yeah, I would
Please.
imagine the gals were farther away from the railing at that point, but
Perhaps
those-
sheltered by the gallant businessmen from the horror of the wreck. But here the buck lies, and John, you have some insights, I think, about this or the do you?
Well,
Or have I punted to you without any warning? Sorry.
that's okay. The A on the stack stands for allied oil. So
Associated, I think it is.
associated.
Associated oil.
Yeah. In pictures, the Frank Buck, she changes location. Seems to be that when she hit and she went down by the bow. She wasn't able to beach herself. She was headed for the beach, went down by the bow, she struck, and then she swung 180 degrees. And this was her final resting position. Just out of view to the right is that the engine block from her sister ship. She wrecked, I think, no further than 80 or 100 yards away. Again, that's why the Ripleys believe it or not.
Right.
Next slide.
And the
Yeah.
President Coolidge.
Yeah, go back to the Coolidge.
Yeah, so the vessel which struck her had a distinguished but relatively short career, was commandeered for service during World War II as a troop ship. And she brought some of the first of reinforcements of MacArthur's army to Australia to begin the Pacific campaign. But while carrying troops of the 37th Infantry Division to outbound from New Caledonia, what did we decide it was? Espiritu Santos, a Pacific island south of the Solomon Islands. She blundered into a so-called friendly minefield laid for protection of the harbor against probing Japanese submarines by the Allies. But the minefield didn't know any better and blew up and sank the Coolidge in shallow water near the harbor entrance in calm conditions. And calm conditions and great discipline reigned there were over 4,000 soldiers aboard. I believe there were only 4 fatalities. Everyone was evacuated safely. Everyone else was evacuated safely to serve again in the Pacific campaign. And the Coolidge still lies in shallow water in this tropical island and is apparently a world-class, a remarkable dive site, well preserved in shallow, warm, tropical waters adjoining the Coral Sea.
and
Going back
oh,
to Frank Buck.
Yeah.
The looky-loos on the bluffs at Land's End. Again, remember I said she moved positions here. She is with her bow in the bottom and her stern facing more out to the Pacific Ocean. This is before she swung around. interesting details is a battleship. We're pretty sure that's a battleship passing in the background. But I'm always intrigued by the way people dressed to go scrambling around the cliffs at Land's End. Got to make sure you got a suit and tie on. Next one. And remember I said about the streetcars were advertising these events to carry extra passengers? Sign says, "This car direct, tanker Frank H. Buck on the rocks." This is at what's called Mary Way. Give you a location. This is only about a block from what's now called the Land's End Lookout. So the passengers were disembarking here, and it was maybe 3/4 of a mile walk to where the Frank Buck was on the beach.
And with the next photo, I'm just imagining other ships coming through this part and crossing themselves when you're seeing this trying to get through the Golden Gate.
Yep. There's a couple of intrepid, probably crewmen, on the walkway just forward of the foremast. And in the background, you've got the Ohioan, and there's that ubiquitous wave motor. Next. This great view. That funny thing in the background, just above the bow of the Ohioan, that's the Haviside salvage barge. It was a huge barge with a huge boom on it, like a crane, and it's headed in. It's headed over to the Frank Buck, probably going to render whatever help it possibly can. At this point, though, not much you could have done.
You could also see the Baroque light next in the distance beyond the Frank Buck.
Right.
Mhm.
Right.
What was the economy around salvaging? Like, was there, I assume there were all kinds of companies that were dedicated to this.
Well, you're going to try to get the oil out if you can. Less concern over spilling it then in terms of ecology, more in terms of, saving it. But after that, they're going to save what they can that could be reused. It's not a question of recycling as much as it's one of, I'll save that winch, I'll get those anchors, I'll get this other gear. But salvage has always been it's an ancient and it's an honorable part of the profession in terms of getting things out. Then, of course, as well, coastal communities were no strangers to, how is it put, the bounty of the sea. I think a number of Christmas trees in San Francisco may have benefited from some of the toys that washed ashore from the Frank Buck.
And there was, once the official salvers were done, or maybe behind their backs, there was a lot of unofficial salvaging theft that went on. Locals would make their way out to the wrecks, and to this day, we're still finding pieces in private collections. I think we have some of them came from the Cliff House. Don't we have the wheel of the Frank Buck?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
In the bad old days, I mean, there's stories of wreckers of this particularly in England, I think, but went on, I'm sure, where people actually would light bonfires ashore to lure ships on the rocks and out at that Land's End in England. And I believe that sort of monkey business was part of the plot of a Gilbert and Sullivan operetta, the Pirates of Penzance was,
Okay.
we
this photo, wish it was higher quality. This is a great photo because you got the Buck, you've got a barge alongside, you've got the Haviside big barge coming in, and in the foreground, that's the engine casing from Lyman Stewart.
And
Yeah.
here too.
And there it is too, right?
Kind of a comparison. That's the a recent photo of the engine block of the Lyman Stewart with the truncated Mile Rock Lighthouse behind.
Right.
And John, the wheel that we have that we got from the Cliff House auction, the plaque that came along with it. This is what makes our jobs as historians really hard. It says the wheel from both the Ohioan and the Frank S. Buck, which I don't think is possible.
No, no, they didn't reuse it. No.
But
No,
but you did that oral history with George Whitney, and he mentions going out on the Ohioan. So we think maybe Ohioan, but
yeah.
more work to be done there. And of course, the archaeology aspect to this, Jim, is where you've done so much great work. All of you have, but Steve and Jim, you've done so much work around these submerged wrecks.
Well,
This is
I
us in
just,
2016.
my work, to be honest, has been in support of Jim, who is truly renowned in the field as a maritime archaeologist. Here you could see us during a NOAA expedition, which Jim played a key role in. We're at Land's End, and we've got that George Davidson map that was at the beginning of the slideshow. Here it's on site near the end of our slideshow as Jim and I are doing a press availability. Jim, you want
This is 2016, and it was,
Yeah.
being an old Star Trek fan, I wanted to do a 5-year mission. Off the Golden Gate, come home, and do that as Director of Maritime Heritage. Instead, we had a 3-year mission, but in that, we dived some of the deeper wrecks with robotics, the Ituna, the Selja, the remains, the mud-shrouded remains of the clipper ship Noonday. We went into Tamales Bay and did probing in the mud at the spot where the Coast Survey had accurately charted and came down on the shell hatch and the crunchiness of the worm-eaten Oxford, which had sailed into San Francisco during the gold rush. The captain really was off in his bearings. He sailed right on up, cut across by Bodega Bay, sailed into Tamales Bay and said, "Where's the town?" He'd missed it. But what I always like is, of course, San Francisco during the gold rush, he sailed in with the perfect cargo for Gold Rush San Francisco. His cargo was ice packed in straw and whiskey. We also found a mysterious tugboat, which turned out to be the USS Conestoga, a Navy tug that had left Mare Island and disappeared with all hands in 1921. All 58 guys. An incredibly sad and powerful story. We were able to reach out to a number of family members and conducted a memorial service for them in Washington, D.C. at the National Navy Memorial. An incredible project, and one that enabled me to come home and see my two brothers, John and Steve. And there's Steve as the historian for Golden Gate National Recreation Area as we're working together. But one of the things we also did is the team went out and we did a sonar scan under the water of what's left of Buck and Stewart, and that's the mud-shrouded city of Rio. Yes, it kind of looks like a cloud, and and then there's Buck and Stewart scanned by sonar. And chime in, guys. You all know what it took for me to get a U.S. government ship to back into that spot to get this.
Yep. It's
Yeah.
incredible.
Yeah.
Well, technology certainly made a great difference and continues to make a phenomenal difference in discovery of our underwater heritage, maritime heritage.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we just announced last week, finding USS Stewart 3,506 feet down, 30 miles off Bodega Bay, sunk by the Navy in May of 1946. A credible history, 4-Piper destroyer, Asiatic squadron, badly damaged, Badong Strait, fighting the Japanese at the beginning of the war, taken as a capsized, damaged hulk, raised, rebuilt by Shizuo Fukui of the Imperial Japanese Navy, becomes a patrol boat, seen by the Navy, known as the ghost ship of the Pacific because she was back from the dead, surrendered at the end of the war and brought home to San Francisco and scuttled. And with that, I mean, such a powerful tale of not just the ship's history, but the fact that the Navy, in bringing her home, treated it as a recovered POW. As referred to, they couldn't get the old name back because Stewart had been given to another destroyer. So she was called RAMP, or Recovered Allied Military Personnel, the term for POWs. RAMP 224, from 224 being her old hull number. And RAMP 224, ex-Stewart, they called her, was sunk quickly out there by the Navy. And last time seen was May of 46. And 3 autonomous underwater vehicles, basically torpedo-shaped instruments with sonar, surveyed what? Excuse me, 100 square miles of seabed in a few hours, picked up a long target in sonar that sure looked like a destroyer. And then we dropped a remotely operated vehicle down from the island Pride. I did the dive from this very same spot on this laptop, helping direct it with my colleagues as 3,500 feet down. We investigated and documented her and then shared it. And with that, the ability to reconnect on another shipwreck with John Martini.
Right. So the icing on the cake for this story is another story worthy of Ripley's Believe It or Not. John, you want to tell us how you are associated with the USS Stewart?
Yeah, we're talking about the USS Stewart. She was a 4-piper destroyer. I married into a Navy family. My wife, Betsy, both her father and her grandfather were U.S. Navy officers. And turns out that her grandfather had been the captain of the USS Stewart in the 1920s. And we have family photos of him revisiting the Stewart when she had been returned as the ex-POW Stewart. We have pictures of him standing on his old command when she was tied up over in Oakland. Yeah, history makes circles sometimes, and this is one of them.
And there's so much personal history for so many people connected to these wrecks. That's a point you all have made repeatedly today and in conversations elsewhere. And I know that there's a devotion to finding these wrecks amongst you that is so admirable. What is the paperwork like in terms of getting attention to individual wrecks like the Frank Buck, like the Lyman Stewart here? Like you mentioned it earlier, Jim, that it was a whole process. How does it go from I want to find out more about this wreck to the approval process to getting actually down inside a wreck site?
Well, back in the day when a lot of this work was starting, the Golden Gate National Recreation Area's boundaries went out a quarter mile offshore. So the beaches, a number of areas where different entities had transferred them, whether it was the Army, whether it was San Francisco Parks or others, to create the park. We had the authority as the Park Service to work on some of those sites, particularly with something like the King Philip. Where it got interesting was with something like the Ohioan, we didn't, but we were able to negotiate with California State Lands Commission and got a 99-year lease of the seabed within the boundaries of the park to do that. And that also ultimately included the same for Point Reyes National Seashore.
Right, to clarify, Jim, that sorry for interrupting you, that the boundaries of the park are the water, extend to the water a quarter miles offshore, but the sea floor is State Lands Commission.
Right, but we leased it.
Got it.
From the
right.
In my time, it was in the aftermath of somebody taking some brass out of the Ohioan and Park Police stopping that, we were able to negotiate with State Lands, and Brian actually signed it. No, actually, I think it was Jack Davis, but as a superintendent. But anyway, these days you need, if you're going to go as an individual to like find something offshore, you need a permit, and that doesn't member of the public or another government person. I had a permit actually from NOAA to go and do the survey with our colleagues to find Stewart most recently, and then filed a complete report with all of the data going to them. The other bit of paperwork that comes in is not everything that's old is historic, and not everything that's historic is particularly significant, or at least nationally significant. So a lot of the work we did early on, and these guys were active participants in this, was we would assess things in the park and say, okay, this is important, and we would nominate it to the National Register of Historic Places. That's the nation's primary means of determining significance, and it guides a lot of law, particularly in terms of mitigating any effects that are going to happen. Something's going to happen. You want to make sure that you've got some authority to do something about it, whether it's document it, keep it from happening, whatever it does. That's what the National Register will bring to it. And these guys both, we all worked on these nominations, but some of them of national importance were also then looked at and studied and designated as national landmarks. Alcatraz, which they did. Fort Point was an earlier one. The historic ships at Hyde Street Pier. Steve and I both tackled those back and forth, but also, some of the wrecks. King Philip and Reporter together are on the National Register. Frank Buck, Lyman, Stewart are not. City of Rio de Janeiro on the National Register. Point Bonita Light on the National Register. The former Marine Exchange Station out at Land's End on the National Register. Cliff House, Sutro Baz, and the rest, Sutro Heights, were not for a number of years. We had a long fight with everybody over that, because at the stage we were doing those nominations originally, it was like, well, that's just a bunch of ruins. And I think a number of folks had mistaken, the fact that the baths burned in '66 as being too modern, not thinking of what Adolf Sutro had done in the last century. So there's a lot of paperwork that's involved, but where I think you've really hit the head is the most important paperwork, now, of course, all electronic medium, is exactly what we're doing today. All three of us started as interpretive rangers, walking and talking about this. And I still think that's one of the best ways to do it. And it's delightful to see John doing that. And in that, sharing the history and taking you to these spots. The media as well has always been there. And that's one reason why. After Steve and I had done a government report saying, okay, here's everything we think it is, and these are the histories, we then wanted to rewrite it all with the blessing of the park and make something that was accessible to the public. Because ultimately, if you can't make it understandable to everybody, from a 5-year-old to a 55-year-old and beyond, on both sides of those ages, then you're not doing your job, or at least that's what I was told the first time I put that green uniform on. And probably the guy that probably told me something like that was John Martini.
And the book,
That's well put, Jim. But another thing, as we sort of come to the close of this voyage, is to remember that these sites are of interest and a degree of historical romance and excitement to us now, but they were often the events of excruciating hard work and exertion to the point of exhaustion, occasionally terror and death to people. Military vessel losses are rightly treated as honored grave sites. And so should, informally at least, if not otherwise, civilian sites of loss. So we should enjoy these soberly.
Yeah.
Nicole, don't we have one to wrap up?
Yeah, we're gonna zoom through. I think a good way for you to exit on that spirit, everybody, is to talk a little bit about.
Yes, yes, yes.
Let's flip back to that, John. That was a perfect segue. Nicole, can you go back to the first the picture with me with Bob? John, that's a good point. And I guess as we come towards a closure here, one of the wrecks that I mentioned earlier was Conestoga, the Navy tug. When we did that survey on the NOAA ship Fulmar, one of the things that we were looking at was a recently revealed sonar target, that showed a wreck off of Southeast Farallon where none had been charted. When we went and looked at it and ultimately dropped a small remotely operated vehicle on it, and here you see Bob and I on Fulmar taking a look at it, it turned out to be a tugboat. But as we continued to probe at that over the course of that mission and a return, it turned out to be a U.S. Navy tugboat. And let's go to the next slide, because that tugboat, and this is a painting of what we saw with the little ROV there. And trust me, again, coming back to the earlier question, how do you know what it is? The bow, the equipment, everything in this place, even the layout of the stern, all showed us that this was a tugboat with its reel for towing something, an open forecastle, forecastle, the machinery all in place, a triple expansion marine steam engine. But as we looked at all of that, it was an older tug. And it turned out to be this tug. This is the USS Conestoga, built as a railroad tug in 1909. Put into service in World War I. And then in 1921, on the West Coast, getting equipped to go out first to Pearl Harbor, then to American Samoa. It had guys on board that weren't part of the crew, but were passengers essentially as naval personnel that were going to be dropped off at Pearl. Departed Mare Island after some repairs. The pumps were old and had rusted out close to the junction of the hull. Sailed out and disappeared. No trace ever reportedly. But interestingly enough, some equipment, supplies really, washed ashore not too far from Ocean Beach. Thought at the time was there were some rough waves, probably some stuff washed off. Then the ship's lifeboat showed up, or what they thought was a lifeboat, off the coast of Mexico. Conestoga had never showed up at Pearl. A radio dispatch, seemingly from the tug, had suggested that they were in trouble, had lost their tow, and were heading into port. As to when that message was broadcast, hard to say. So the Navy launched a huge search, air and sea, off of Hawaii, the biggest search ever done by the Navy, air and sea, until Amelia Earhart went missing. The submarine that was dispatched actually ran out of fuel and had to rig all the guys' cots and sew them together. And using the raised periscope on the conning tower, they made a sail and sailed the submarine back to Pearl. So it's a famous episode, but Conestoga, nothing, never heard of again. And ultimately, with our find of this tug, Bob Schwemmer, NOAA's Maritime Heritage Coordinator for the West Coast, was going through the footage we had and spotted a Navy gun. That very gun you see right up there on the before the pilot house. We'd found Conestoga. It was a pretty powerful moment, because suddenly you realize that you've got all these guys. There's the crew. Their families never knew what happened. Newspaper accounts suggested maybe they hadn't been up to the job. Others suggested that they'd run off with the ship and sold it to the Bolsheviks by fleeing to Vladivostok. It was not a good moment. It wasn't a shining moment, but it became one of the top 10 mysteries for the Navy in terms of ships that went missing, never heard of again. one of the most amazing moments in my career as a Fed was sitting down with everybody at the Pentagon, with the Deputy Secretary of the Navy and a bunch of admirals and captains, and talking about this, saying we've got it and going through the evidence, and them saying, well, what should we do? And I said, well, now's the time to notify the families. And with that, they said, well, we don't have a casualty office that goes back before World War II. But at NOAA, we had a genealogist who we were working with who had helped us track down families of the guys who died on the wreck of the USS Monitor, also a NOAA Marine Sanctuary. So turned her loose on that, and ultimately found a number of these folks, because the one thing I didn't want to do as a government official was to have this go out to the press, be leaked, or be revealed, and somebody watches this and goes, what? So with that, and with Lisa Stansbury's work as a genealogist, I started calling people, getting their numbers, and saying, I'm calling you on behalf of the United States government to let you know we found your great uncle's ship, or we found your grandfather's ship. That I did that a few times in my career with the government, and it's powerful, it's undescribable in a way. It's humbling, it's terrible, it's also one of the best things you could do. We ultimately had a memorial service for these guys at the National Navy Memorial, as I'd said. And with that, as we read the names, each time we rang the bell, a seaman rang the bell for them in that time-honored tradition. Conestoga is now on the National Register. It is a grave that is protected by U.S. law because it is a military vessel, and it's protected by the Sunken Military Craft Act, but it's also within the boundaries of Greater Fairlawn's National Marine Sanctuary. Technology played a role, but ultimately technology is only as good as the hands that drive it and the hearts that direct it. And so with that, I think it was one of the more amazing shipwreck projects that I've had a chance to work on. And like John, I've dived and worked on the wreck of the Arizona and a number of other wrecks, and was the first archaeologist not associated with the Salvage to dive Titanic. They all have their meaning, but this one in particular meant a lot. One, close to home in San Francisco, but also to be able to do what we were able to do as the U.S. government for the families of all these guys.
If I can add something here, is, as I mentioned earlier, I married into a Navy family, and Betsy's father and grandfather were both Navy officers, and her father was a Navy pilot, and he was killed when his plane went down ferrying nurses to the Korean War somewhere in the Pacific. His plane disappeared, and they were never able to find him or any of the other 30-odd passengers that were on his plane. And to this day, it's a huge hole in the family, is what happened to Shelby. You were able to answer that for these sailors' families. Thank you, Jim.
It's yeah, I mean, I guess that's one reason why the three of us went into public service, guys. It's not just because we loved history and we like to talk about it. There was something profound that I really appreciated in serving with the two of you as brothers in those uniforms, and then later with NOAA. And in part, it is that you work for the public. It is a government for the people, by the people, and of the people. And so, yeah.
Yeah, that's really,
It's a part of our heritage, I guess, to say it in just a few words, what these guys have said more eloquently in many words.
no, that's really true. For every piece of metal that we're left with, and that we can see, that the human element behind all of it is what makes the work worth doing. And that includes what you all have done here. The work that the amount of hours that you put in to figuring this out. I love that you've called it service, because you don't get rich doing this kind of work, right? All of us are here digging deep to find what happened in the eras before us, not for ourselves, but for the record that we can leave to future generations as well. And it's a memorial to everybody who's come before us. So thank you, all three of you, for what you do and what you continue to do, and spending time with us here, and all the people, all the resources that we've been able to utilize in sharing these stories today and throughout your careers. There's a lot of archivists and genealogists and divers, and the list goes on and on. We don't have enough time here, but Jim, John, and Steve, thank you so much for being with us today. Really appreciate your time and your work.
And we
Thank you.
appreciate your work too, Nicole.
Yeah, absolutely.
In local history.
Good.
Thanks, guys. It's
Thanks.
great working with you always.
I'll be your history
Likewise.
anytime, you
Good.
guys.
Big fan of Western Neighborhoods and all that you do. So thank you.
Good.
I'm gonna pivot from that into some more shameless plug for Shipwreck Week, which continues for the rest of this week. This was the launch, if you will. Some big in-person events that we have coming up on October 16th. We have trivia night at the Riptide Bar, which I might be pulling photographs, or I might be pulling photographs and trivia from this program to to build out our questions. There will be special prizes, and I will be wearing a sailor's hat the entire time. There will be sailor's hat for other people at the bar too. So please come out, support your local bar. On Thursday, this one's very special. Kirsten Quam and Sabrina Oliveros are giving us a behind-the-scenes tour of the Maritime Visitors Center and collection storage. You cannot get access to collection storage normally. This is a really big deal. And we will be sharing a special ghost story related to the Rio de Janeiro at the Visitors Center. So we've got 2 tickets left for that. You're going to want to reserve your spot today. And then, of course, on Saturday, the 19th, John Martini will be leading his famed Land's End History Walk. And if you forget to reserve your tickets, you can find more information on our Eventbrite, or you can follow us on social media, Outside Lands with a Z, because that's how cool kids spelled things in the 90s when we were founded. And again, if you enjoyed today, we appreciate the donations, but of course it's not mandatory. We hope you enjoyed this program for SF Shipwreck Week, the 2nd year running. We will be doing it again next year if you aren't able to join us this year. And thank you again, fellas, for being with us. And thank you for everybody who's watching us now on what might be a 3-hour tour.
Fair winds and following seas.
This has been
May
incredible.
the wind be at your back.
And may the next time we're all together, we are sharing a glass of whiskey. And Jim, the next time you're in San Francisco, I'll have to take you to this special house in the Sunset District off Taraval that is it's built out to look like the USS Enterprise, and the man who owns it has legally changed his name to Captain Kirk.
Right.
Years ago when they were filming Star Trek IV, they were shooting it right there at Fort Point, weren't they, guys?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah. I mean, we've all got stories of different movie stars that we all met, like on Alcatraz, but this is a scream, because I'm walking out towards Fort Point, and William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy are walking by, and they're in costume, and they're chatting, and I said, "Gentlemen," and Shatner typically goes, "We're a little busy here, officer." My William Shatner encounter, you know.
I think that's the perfect place for us to end our voyage today. Thank you again for being with us. And I hope we can do something together again for Shipwreck Week 2025 next year.
Likewise.
Same here.
All right.